very good to see all of you here, especially our group who's come from all across the country for this program, the Alcott Experience. I want to take this evening to explore together some thoughts along some lines that I think are important. Very often when John tells me he needs a title, I find myself thinking about what is it that I need to know more about? What is it that I need to investigate more deeply? So, that's something that I can learn by going into a consideration of the subject, and we can do it together. So for me, this subject of the importance of the center is something that just seems to have the meaning of the moment. For me, as John has said, recently, of course, there's been this evolution in my relative responsibilities to this international presidency. But, one of the things that is the underlying foundation for all of this work, there is what are called the three objects of the Theosophical Society. Many of you are familiar with them. From time to time, John will go over them at the beginning of meetings. But the first one is the only one that really want to go into in any depth at all. The first object of the Theosophical Society is that it was formed, it is here to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood. That's the language that was used in 1875. Of course, it doesn't just include male brothers. It's of the human family, the universal brotherhood of humanity. So in 1875, this was the declaration of the purpose and reason for this organization, to form a nucleus of this universal brotherhood. So, the whole idea of something central, and there is nothing more central than the nucleus of anything. The nucleus, by definition, is that most central part of a movement, of an organization, of a cell. You pick it. And it's the thing which dictates its activities and from which it draws life. So, to form a nucleus, obviously, given the position I find myself in, I should be asking myself, what does this mean? Rather than just spin my wheels in some direction that seems a little bit meaningless. So what is this nucleus? What does a nucleus mean? Does it only relate to organizational things? And I think it does not. Otherwise, there'd be no point in me speaking with all of you this evening. And so that's really what I'd like to consider together, because I think it's something that across the board, anyone whose interest and whose inclination is to a deepening perception of reality, we focus in one way or another on something we determine to be central. So in the case of the Theosophical movement, the focus was this universal brotherhood of humanity, which is still in the process of being understood. Obviously, since 1875, a lot has changed. The Theosophical Society started in New York City. So, 1875, you think back, and those of us who at least got a C to a C plus in American history will know that that's 10 years after slavery was abolished in the United States of America. 10 years prior to this statement that the focus of this organization is to form this nucleus based on something that disregards the separations of caste, race, religion, color, creed, gender. This was what was forming in the United States with this movement. Obviously, in the intervening years, much has changed. What was, in fact, a revolutionary idea at that time has made its way into the laws of the land, around the world. I mean, following World War II, there was this universal declaration of human rights, which a lot of the language that we find in that first object, you find in this universal declaration. The United Nations said that this experience of World War II was based on a certain blindness to the nature of brotherhood, and it's something we need to make explicit. And so this document is what they came up with, and it's been translated into laws all around the world. But it speaks about rights. You know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is the basis that you have for laws, but this vision of a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, while we have to have this understanding of rights, really, rights is a more superficial aspect. But we need the superficial before we can go a little bit deeper. So when we talk about this universal brotherhood, we're not talking about rights by law. It's not about rights, it's about being. It's about the nature of our shared reality. So, you know, that's really what I'd like to explore a little bit in the time that we do have together this evening. One of the things, when I start to think about it, just by virtue of the position that I'm in, thinking about a center and thinking about centering are necessary parts of what I've got to bring to mind continually. Because, you know, face it, right now I'm president of the United States, TS, and president of the International. So we have here in the US this wonderful space in which we're sitting right now, the Olcott National Center. We have in India, in Adyar, yet another center. So probably as we go through this evening, just by way of examples, we can go through a couple of things. When we talk about a center, you know, here, I think any one of us could use that language and say, where are you? I'm at the Theosophical Society Center, or I'm at the Olcott Center. What does that mean? I mean, obviously, there is some space that you can point to on a map and say, you know, that's where it is. You know, you Google it, there's 42 acres, as John was describing, however many buildings we have, 10, 13 buildings here, and is that the center? Or is that the center and something more? So, you know, here, just like this evening, part of the things that take place in this thing we call a center is where people like us, we come together, we quiet down for a moment, you know, we leave behind all the busy work day, sit down and allow ourselves to listen, and with a little bit of luck, allow ourselves to actually hear together. So that's part of this center. You know, as we're speaking, this is being broadcast to the world. There are people behind that wall. You know, it's like the Wizard of Oz. They're back there, believe me, who are in the process of making this possible. You have a library with people who are operating that. You have maintenance of you have all of these different things going on. Each one involves not just people, but their temperament, their consciousness. All of these things weave together. It's this very multi-layered operation that, when it works properly, we look at it and view it as just one thing. I mean, there are 50, 60, 70 of us here right now. But we view all of this as one thing, a center. I would say that during the course of the time we're speaking this evening, probably the most important idea that we can have in all of this is consciousness. It's the same idea whenever we have a talk. Consciousness is preeminent. That's the one thing, if we're talking real, that's the one thing that really we're ever talking about. My dad died, he was 92 years old. And, you're around someone, I was probably in my 50s when he died. And you're around someone that long, and it's your dad, and he's going over the stories of his life. After about the first 10 years, the stories are fresh. It's like, they don't start to repeat yet. But, you live a little bit longer, and it's like Dad would start a particular story, and I'd find myself just saying, okay, this is the one about, I said, oh yeah, okay, yeah, Dad. And I could go back to thinking about the basketball game or something else, because I know where he was going with this. Honestly, you hate to admit something like this, but I find myself in much the same position now as my dad was. Essentially, as John said, I go around the world. I talk to people in many places, a lot of different cultures. But if you boil it right down, probably there are 2 or 3 things that I'm ever talking about. There's a lot of ways you dress it up. There are a lot of ways that you can go to that same thing, but it's the point of view that really, from what we're talking about, just like really there's one peak to the mountain. And when we get to that peak, everyone who stands there looks in all directions and sees the same thing. But there are many roads that lead up to that peak. So I talk about the roads. And from time to time, it's your experience that something about the nature of these peak experiences and the wisdom that they afford to us becomes your experience. That's the hope. So the center, an example being this organization. I can give you an example that's closer to home, which would be your own physical body. There's a lot of things going on in this thing that we point to and call me. It begins with, I don't know the real number, but it's several trillion cells. And each cell is just an individual life. It cares nothing about what Tim is doing at the moment, has no regard for it. All it wants to do is feed itself and reproduce. And that's what a cell is about. And there's 7 trillion of them doing their thing. And somehow or another, these cells, these very rudimentary sort of consciousness, have this way of coming together and form something that has a higher consciousness. These organs that have very specific functions. But the extension of consciousness takes place in this coming together, in this working together along these very specific lines. And so organs, cells, all of this, at a certain point, the consciousness at every one of these levels becomes ever more extended, until we reach the point where there is this I that really is the one that we see runs the total show. And we point to ourselves and say, I am. If we wanted to, we could do things to disrupt the lives of these cells. If we wanted to disobey the law of gravity, the whole thing would come apart if we jumped from a high enough building. So there is this continual gradations and expansions of consciousness and of function, all of these things somehow working together. When they work together, it can be a beautiful thing. Obviously, we have the examples of when things do not work together. I mean, actually, within the body, when we talk about the disease that seems to be on the rise in the culture worldwide, cancers. Cancer, by definition, is unregulated growth of the cells. It's like, for whatever reason, this particular region of the body has taken it upon itself to just multiply in an unregulated way, completely out of cooperation, out of harmony with the rest of the body and its functions. And if it happens at a sufficient rate, it will compromise the health of the entire unit. So the consciousness of that particular disease is one that is disruptive in that way. In the esoteric teachings, there is this idea of what is a human being. I've said it before, but human being is something that's very clearly defined and described. It's said that a human being is highest spirit and lowest matter linked by mind. H.P. Blavatsky put it a little bit differently, saying that there are three streams that come together. Each one has its own specific laws. So there's a spiritual stream, there's what's described as an intellectual or mental stream, and there's a physical stream. And where they meet is this point that we describe as humanity, as the human being. And the laws and the consciousness of those streams, each one has its own particular groupings, its own particular approaches. And it's spread throughout. Again, you take the example of human society. It used to be in the old days, and in a couple of places they still have it, where there's a king. King is the top of all the operations of the nation. But what does a king do? You know, all of the other workers within the kingdom, they build the roads, the treasury pays the bills, the army protects the nation, and the king basically sits and focuses the efforts of the whole. And his consciousness spreads throughout the kingdom, his or her when there are queens. So, in a similar way, this human experiment, this is sort of the way that it functions with us, that there is a spiritual dimension to our being at one end, there is a physical pole at the other, and we really find ourselves moving in between. And depending on where it is that we're able to focus our awareness, will condition what it is that we see as real and how it is that we behave. H.P. Blavatsky made the comment that whatever plane it is, our consciousness is acting in. For the time being, the only things that are real will be ourselves and the things of that particular plane. I think it's a profound statement. If you ever think about times when you have found yourself overcome with anger or with sadness, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of thought to remember that at those moments, if you're angry, there's a very clear enemy. And everything relates to the expression of this sense of hostility toward that enemy. If you're sad, the whole world goes gray. The realities that we experience are completely conditioned by the plane that our consciousness operates on from moment to moment. Wherever that is centered determines our experience. And so the whole idea of this spiritual life, or the approach that we take to it, is to try to move our center. Try to do those things that will affect where and how it is we are able to place this consciousness. So how do we do that? There is this idea, and it's expressed in the book, The Mahatma Letters, one of the seminal books in the Theosophical kind of literature. There's this expression that I really do love. I mean, I find myself going back to it repeatedly. It's the idea, the way it is expressed, is that from moment to moment, each one of us is we're engaged in a process of what is described as peopling our current in space. I love the language, really. That we are populating with our ideas, with our emotions, with the various sentiments and sensations we experience. We are continuously creating a population that surrounds us, a thought atmosphere. And it's something we know about that because everybody has had the experience around others. I had the experience of being around the Dalai Lama for a couple of days when we invited him here in 2011. Remarkable man. And when you're around him, you find yourself, people like that, you find yourself looking at things that are trying to find something mystical, something different. When you're around him, though, he's like your grandfather. He's talking, he'll take your hand, and very warm grandfatherly person, but very different things have a tendency to happen around him. So during my time there, for instance, my daughter, who is not here, when His Holiness was coming in on the plane to Chicago, there was this private jet that flew him, and we met him at the airport. And so the way it goes is, they have this very keenly tuned idea of VIP. So because we were inviting him, the Theosophical Society had invited him, I became a very preeminent sort of guy. So right at the front of the line, I'm there, and he has the scarf, and then my wife and my daughter. My daughter really knew nothing about the Dalai Lama. She knew that he was a famous man. She knew that he was famous for spirituality. But, his life in Tibet, his regard in the world, she didn't know that. So he comes down the line, he talks to me, he puts the scarf around my neck as a blessing. He talks to my wife longer than he talks to me, I should say also. Puts the scarf around her neck. And then he comes to my daughter. And she's there, with her little scarf. He talks to her, and he talks to her for longer than he talked to my wife. And about school, about different things. And then he moves on. Very nice, simple. He gets in his motorcade to go, and my daughter breaks down crying. Just breaks down crying. And, I go over to her and I said, what's wrong? Put my arm around, what happened, Angelique? It's the Dalai Lama, why are you crying? And so what she said is something about, it talks about this atmosphere that he surrounded himself with through his practice and through his life. She said, when he came up to me in that line, and when he looked me in my eye, she said, I felt so strong. That was it. I felt so strong. And that's why she was crying. The presence that we carry communicates. You know, there's that expression, I think it's Emerson that said it, who you are speaks so loudly that I can't hear a word you're saying. It's real. We know that's real. I mean, similarly, we have had the experience of being around people who are down, who are depressed even. And if you're not very aware and you find yourself sitting in their presence, you know the experience. You find yourself coming away feeling drained. So there is this atmosphere that we create around us with every thought we think, with every aspiration we hold. And it creates, it's like a crowd that interacts with others. You know, it used to be in olden times, the thought of invisible life forms, you know, intelligent patterns of energy that surround us from moment to moment was just common knowledge. You know, the idea of angels, of elementals, of fairies, of all of these different forms, intelligent life forms that interact with us, though invisibly, was normal thinking. I mean, today, of course, we've become much too smart for that. Our limited approach and limited appreciation for science and its offerings have created an iron wall. For those who actually have some awareness of these things, it's created a wall that prevents their discussion. For those who don't, it's something that says it's an impossibility. Why? Because it's not seen. And, you know, quite honestly, the one thing that is preeminent, that spreads across everything, is the most unseen of all, which is consciousness. Consciousness is not seen. Consciousness cannot be measured. Consciousness cannot be tested. But at the same time, everybody knows it's the basis of everything. All understanding, all life forms are conscious and expressing it in different ways. So this invisible sort of aspect is one that is, I think, largely overlooked. It used to be, and again, in the language of the older esoteric traditions, you have various names for, you know, archangels, Dayan Chohans, Pitris, Rishis, just name after name after name, depending on the culture that you're in. But I think for us, we don't have any problem accepting the idea that at this particular moment, there are patterns of intelligence playing upon us at every moment. I mean, John asked you to turn off your cell phones because if he had not, someone's would ring and there would be a voice that is unseen on the other end of the line. And, you know, to us, this is normal. I mean, imagine that 300, 400 years ago, somebody would be going to the fire if your phone rang and you started talking to someone and then could put it and hold it up to the priest's ear. It would be the end of your cell phone career. But again, you know, we live in a different time. So part of what it is that we do, there is in the world, and probably many of you have had these experiences, there are places in the world that we can call sacred places, all around the world. The people of different countries and different cultures know the places that are within their region. Very often it talks about a physical place. At the very high levels of consciousness, obviously, every place is sacred. every place is holy. I think it was in the Bible, Moses, the place where I stand is holy ground. Because his realization was that the divine is not absent from any space in the universe. But until that becomes our normal experience, very often there are these sacred places that people find themselves drawn to and have been drawn to for millennia. Now, these sorts of places, there are a couple of ways in which a place becomes sacred. One of which relates to earth energies, of course. You know, people talk about sacred mountains and sacred lakes. When I was in Tibet, I guess it's 6, 7 years ago, we were doing a lot of driving. And so you drive, and of course you're driving up and down mountains, because that's what you do in Tibet. So whenever you would come to the top of a mountain, you would always find that it's just completely decorated with prayer flags. Thousands of them would be flying in the air. These red and the colors of all the 5 elements. The flags would be flying in the air. And there was this custom that when you come to the top of the mountain, every time we would shout out. And the expression was, Kiki soso la gelo, which really it meant, it wasn't something that we do here, so I had to learn it. But our drivers loved it, and they would join in. It means something like happiness, happiness, blessings, blessings, La, which is the God of the place, the overlighting intelligence of this mountain. And that's the normal recognition of these places. They're sacred in that they are inhabited. The earth energies are such, we talk about ley lines and things like that. The earth energies are such that they are also attractive, not just to human beings, but to so many things that we don't see. And so this combination of forces creates these sacred places that people come to again and again. Another way that places become sacred is through human interaction. So all around the world, there are people who will be going to pilgrimage places. Places where holy people have set. Places where holy people have had experiences that have opened them to different sorts of levels of unfoldment. And so people flock there and feel things. If depending on a person's sensitivity, they will have some sort of experience. I knew someone who didn't have a particular experience, but they wanted to. They went and they followed in the footsteps of, I think it was Mary Baker Eddy. They were looking for a particular type of experience, and they didn't know quite how to get it, and everywhere she went, they would have gone, and they would sit and try and get it. But this is the way these places become holy. Also, they become holy through use. The Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln talked about the blood and the lives that had been lost toward this higher ideal. He said that the words that we say cannot sanctify this place beyond the lives that have been given in this state. I was recently, just about 2 weeks ago, was in Amsterdam. And I had always heard about the Anne Frank house, the book that we probably all read in high school, The Diary of Anne Frank. I had a chance to go there. It's a smallish building, former warehouse in Amsterdam, where Anne Frank, her family, and 6 or 7 others were hidden during the Nazi occupation of Holland, of the Netherlands. And they hid there for about 2 years. And I went in there, I knew the story, and I went in there because it was something that I felt I just wanted to expose myself to. But I have to say, it was one of the most moving museum sort of experiences I've ever had. I found myself just on the verge of tears of inspiration, as well as just tears of, how can we do this to each other? But this is a place where thousands of people, I mean, I don't even know how I was able to get in. It was a miracle because I hadn't booked a ticket. But thousands of people come through this place to celebrate the flexibility of the human spirit and its ability to absorb and to overcome, and the ability to aspire even beyond death and limitations. It's become a shrine of that sort through use. So there are a couple of ways these things become holy, become sacred. So part of the process for us in trying to make this shift, in trying to move this center of awareness from whatever it is that currently absorbs our attention to something else, involves this same process of making, first of all, recognizing, and then creating a space for the sacred to live within us and to make itself known. We do it with everything else. Now, sometimes I talk to people about meditation. You go to your home, it doesn't make any difference if you're 1 bedroom or 15 bedrooms. And I know all of you live in 15-bedroom homes, that's why I say that. We have a space where we cook our meals. And we go there and we chop the vegetables and you have it just so that when you cook and when you prepare, it can be something you can invest with love for your family or for yourself. We have a bedroom that is, at least when we're doing it, when we want to do it that way, is decorated so that we can just come in and be relaxed, fall asleep. We have a bathroom for all the things we do in there. What is it that would be perhaps the highest activity that we engage in during the course of a day? For those of us to whom this idea of the possibility of spiritual unfoldment is real, then perhaps prayer, meditation, quiet. I just read a quote, and I forget, it was from a scientist, I think it's Blaise Pascal. He said, all of humanity's problems come from, he said, man's inability, but I'm going to include the rest of you too, because I know it's true. Man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. I mean, that's breaking it way down, All of the problems we experience result from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. So, the creation within us of some sort of center that is given over to this activity of quiet first. We have used over the course of our lifetime part of the mark of a successful person is that they are able to take their will and overcome. Overcome personal limitations, overcome obstacles in the surrounding environment. This is the thing that is the hallmark of what is generally deemed success, the application of will to the world around us. And this is something that we have been engaged in various ways throughout our lifetime, but more importantly, throughout this stream of lifetimes that has led to this moment. And so it comes as something of a difficulty to even grasp what it is we're talking about when we say that there is another use of the will, a higher use of the will that is not just about imposing it upon the world around us. But when we start talking about this next level of our own unfoldment, the use of the will that becomes all important is that instead of making things happen, we learn to use the will to allow things to be as they are. To allow. It's a very, very qualitatively different expression of this vital force within us. So we find a way to sit quietly alone. We find a way to use the will to allow the perception of what is in front of us. We don't have to shape it. We don't need to make it. None of that. You know, the usual things we engage in. If some sound occurs that's jarring, we don't like it. We push it away. You know, our whole life is spent in attaching ourselves to some things we like and pushing away the rest. You know, attachment and aversion is the way we spend our life, never really being able to see anything for what it is. So there's this process that we engage in. And, you know, there's a certain element of it involves thought, of course. Ultimately, we leave thought behind if we're really going to get quiet. But there are certain powerful thoughts that we can invite into these moments that can create the possibility for this centering. Such thoughts as, you know, this most basic recognition that really has us all in these seats tonight. Recognition that within me there's something I could describe as a spark. A spark that somehow derives from an eternal flame. Little one, big one. But that we know that we have the capacity to fan the spark so that it too can flame up. And then the separation, you know, they meet. We find that they have always been one. They're not different. They're not separate. So that's a recognition that there is a spark within me that I will allow the air to blow on. You know, the air of an uncontrolled mind, you know, a mind we're not trying to regulate and direct, to fan the spark into a flame. Another thought, you know, depending on your tradition, from the Christian tradition, there's this idea that of the Father who is in heaven, or the Father who is in secret, is one of the ways it's expressed. That we allow for the possibility of a connection with this overarching consciousness that is ever present. And in this moment, we allow for that. In H.P. Blavatsky, she, if you read her writings, peppered throughout everything she writes. She's always talking about meditation, the great meditators. Nowhere, or almost nowhere, does she talk about, you know, how do you meditate? You know, it's a great thing. People have benefited, wonderful. But now what do I do? That's one of the missing things, largely. But there's one thing that she did write, which is called the diagram of meditation. And the very first line of that talks about First, try to conceive of unity, which is obviously impossible. Unity as a conception, it doesn't work, but try, to conceive of unity by expansion in space. Anybody who has a conception of the divine, somehow or another, the closest thing that we know of that can speak to the qualities of divinity is space, because it's endless. It's everywhere present. So, through expansion in space and infinite in time, it's a tough one. But that's the idea. Something that exceeds our capacity of thought is what we allow for. So this is the centering process. And, probably of the many things that we find in this world today that are necessary, everybody looks around and we all see, if you have your eyes open at all, you see that there are areas that require our attention, and in some areas our immediate attention. But, there's this expression, don't just sit there, do something, which I've heard reversed, don't just do something, sit there. Don't just do something, sit there, and from that sitting, what you do will be purposeful. And I think we find ourselves in need of not just mere activity, but activity informed by something deeper that's already waiting to make itself known. So we've got a job to do, but we have the tools to do it. I think Voltaire gets a lot of the credit for this particular quote, but apparently it actually dates back way before him, a fellow by the name of Empedocles, speaking about the divine and speaking about this aspect of a center that describes God as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. The state of connection that in many ways we aspire to through our silence is the recognition that this point of the divine surrounds us at every moment, is without any sort of binding circumference. And this is a realization that has power.
This is pretty literal-minded of me, but when you first started talking about a nucleus, the function of a nucleus being to provide a center for whatever is aggregating around it to make an identity, I was wondering about how that works with something like a plant. If the seed is the nucleus of the plant, but the plant is growing linearly, do you have any observations on that? I mean, I know it sounds silly, but I'm just seeing it as a different shape entirely in space.
Mm-hmm. Probably within every plant, as within the cells in our own body. I'm no biologist, but there are nuclei throughout. Actually, even with the Theosophical Society, the wording of that first object is interesting, really, because it is to form a nucleus, not the only one, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity. It's in keeping with this idea that a circle whose center is everywhere. So all throughout the plant, as all throughout our bodies, as all throughout this organism that we describe as humanity, there are multiple sorts of focuses like that. So probably, that would be as close. If we had a biology person, they could probably do the answer justice. Yeah.
You mentioned sacred places in Anne Frank's home. And I think that's sacred because of the to us that read about it in high school because of this epic battle between good and evil that seems to have occurred there. And I wonder if you'd comment on something near and dear to my heart. There seems to be a spot, there is a spot, Cannonball, South Dakota, that suddenly became sacred. It's a tiny little altar that was used 1,000 years ago, and you may or may not have heard about it, but the hugest uprising, peaceful, of Native Americans since Custer's battle, 10,000. This little prayer site is bulldozed all of a sudden to run 40,000 gallons of oil across the Missouri aquifer where 10 million people get their drinking water. And suddenly, 10,000 tribes that can't even talk to each other. Five Indians in a room, Native Americans, and 3 of them are calling 2 of them liars. And now they're all there. And everything you said, areas require attention. Don't just do something, sit there. Don't just sit there, do something. They're doing both. They're just sitting in front of bulldozers and saying, please save our planet. So I wonder if it seems like this could be the center of this huge movement that says it's almost all over for everybody. How about paying attention to this? I wonder if you have.
Actually, you meant I've been hearing about the oil pipeline and and the efforts to try and stop. Apparently, it has been stopped temporarily, at least. No, but I mean, this is one of those examples. We can make a place sacred by the behaviors that we invest in that place, and then it becomes attractive. I mean, that's really about all I would say. Human use and the consciousness we invest in it is what creates many of these places, and Frank's home being one of them. Yeah. And thanks for sharing about that update. Yeah.
This is kind of a personal question about maybe some of your own experiences in thinking about the subject that you brought up of our constant grasping and pushing. Have you...
Microphone, yeah.
Oh, you can't. Have you found in dealing with that with yourself that your best solution is in your mindfulness time, in your quiet time, and that in that space, that's where you burn a lot of that off, where you bring resolution to a lot of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, as with anything, all of these things begin with recognition. Right? I find myself often quoting this expression, apparently it's an African expression, that the disease that is hidden cannot be healed. So something that's going on beneath the level of awareness will continue to go on. So it begins very often with, perhaps someone talking about this idea of attachment and aversion. And you ask yourself, is that accurate? Not for that person, but does it apply to me? And then when you look at it, you may find that there's something correct about that there are things we attach ourselves to, things that we spend a lot of energy trying to keep away from us, either out of fear or out of a variety of reasons. And then there's this whole neutral space where we don't really care. And so once you observe that, each one of those activities has a certain energy. And you can become aware of it as it arises within you. If you sit, most people, when they sit in practicing meditation, because generally nobody's meditating when they're sitting down, they are practicing. You'll sit and you'll do what you can to become still, and almost invariably, at some point during your sitting time, some thought will come across your mind. And the quality of it, you'll be able to judge for yourself. It might be something that, oh God, traffic this morning. Well, that's one of those aversion thoughts. It's like, oh man, we'll have donuts in the office today. And that might be one of those attachment thoughts. But if you actually as part of your practice, you get to the point where you can see these things as they arise, rather than after the fact. Then you start to become aware of the actual energy and how and where it arises within you. And just the recognition cuts that process. When you see it, here's a secret. Enlightenment, moksha, freedom, all of it is about seeing what's real. Once you see what's real, you are no longer enslaved by what's not. And once you know, you can't unknow. It's a blessing and it's a curse. So, I mean, that's the process. And if you have a spiritual practice of any sort, you're already engaged in that. But, you know, there are ways to refine it.
I was very touched by the statement that we can use our will to allow things to happen. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you can say more about how we, rather than just allowing things to happen, how do we use our will to allow?
Yeah. In a sense, we would tend to think of it as an abdication of will in our normal thinking. Because if we're not controlling the mind, you know, if we're not regulating the breathing, you know, then what are we doing? So, the scriptures, Christian scripture, there's this statement that unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it, which is perhaps exemplary of this way of being. That, yes, we move. Yes, we are actors. But there's a big difference between my will constructing and this connection to something more vital. It's very, again, it's one of those things that I could give you these examples, but when you're able to see that process first, you know, how is it that from moment to moment we are shaping the world around us? We are demanding it to be a certain way. Part of the process of actually seeing involves somehow being able to release what we accept as real. You know, there's that famous, I think it's a wood block cutting, but it speaks about this process of awakening. And there's a man and there's a screen that's shaped like a spherical sort of screen. And on the inside it has animals and woods painted. But then he pulls up this screen and he pokes his head, and when he looks through to the other side, there are stars and there are galaxies. So this process of somehow being able to lift this veil is what we find ourselves engaged in. And to describe it is somehow a little difficult, but it's one of those things that if we work on the first parts, the other parts reveal themselves, and then it starts to make sense, you know, that we can actually live a life that is, in many ways, effortless. We're doing, we're acting, but it's not with this sort of personalized emphasis.
I have a question. You know, you've over the last 3 to 5 years, especially, you've been kind of on a whirlwind of activity and travel, and you and Lily have been all over the world. So I'm curious, your hopefulness for humanity, how has it changed in the last 3 to 5 years? And then how would it compare to the Tim Boyd when you were 25 years old and intellectually curious college kid?
It's a loaded question, but I'll answer part of it. I'll answer parts of it. I mean, obviously, back in the day, the college day, it was very clear that dramatic change was just around the corner. The revolution was coming. And, the age of the Aquarius was imminent. All the signs were there. So, 40 years later, age of the Aquarius is still on the way. The revolution hasn't happened in any outward sense. Crises that were predictable and some that were not are popping up all over. So, that has required a different sort of focus. The one was the teenager who had a dream, or who was tapping into a dream that was shared by many. And then now you find it actually comes down to this dream, like all others, requires some work. Dreams require a certain sort of unfoldment for the dream to meet the real world. And so that's the process that I see involved now. Now, whereas in the past there were a lot of people who were dreaming, now there are a lot of people who recognize that there's a lot of work that has to be done. And that the bulk of that work, it begins quite internally. And so are committing to that process. The fact that we're all here speaks to this idea that there's importance and value in that. Oftentimes we find ourselves looking for a how-to. Because obviously, for every person, the thing that makes this whole path appealing in any way is the fact that it speaks to something that we already know quite profoundly and quite deeply. And we know what the possibilities are. But that next level of committing ourselves to something that flies in the face of what's regarded as normal and being able to stick with it is very demanding. So very often that's something that has to be done in the quiet of our own mind, in that room where we sit alone. And I see that happening. I'm quite hopeful. I see an awful lot of problems in the world. I mean, it's not just the U.S. This is a global moment. But these are things that everybody that's here, we're not here by accident. I used to feel very sorry for my daughter because, I had the thought, man, what's up ahead? It's terrible what she's going to inherit. Because I had the idea I'd be dead and gone. So it would be her that would suffer. Of course, now, no, I'm not going to be out of here either. So it gets to be doubly important. So these kids, though, who are here, also are not here by accident. And, the things that we don't get, people critique living on screens, but, that cultivates something as well. So it's things that we perhaps don't understand, but things are moving in a way that I think we're going to get there. I would like to think that we will recognize and address things consciously. I often find myself going back to that example that at World War II, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, we were not ready for a war in the United States. But it took 3 days for the rationing, all the various things related to mobilizing for a war effort to be set fully in place. It's an unfortunate aspect that it seems like very often we respond better to crisis than we do to our own understanding. But one way or another, we have the capacity to meet all these things. So, that's the difference between a 25-year-old and whatever age I am now.
Tim, you mentioned the two extremes, attachment and aversion. I think you said the middle ground is awareness, I think.
Yeah.
How do we know when we're there in awareness?
Well, one of the ways is that we find we're not asking. One of the experiences that people have sometimes when they actually are meditating, which is to say when for whatever reason, the mind is no longer the thing that is guiding we've popped above the level of thoughts and we can just kind of observe them, perhaps. One of the things that inevitably pulls people away from that is when they realize that they have gone beyond the mind. And they say, oh, I must be meditating. Or what is this that I see? What is this that I'm feeling? So awareness, I think, we have the capacity to be continuously aware. And it's something that we cultivate. So, and in many ways we do it, first of all, by paying attention. I think very often we are very inattentive. I mean, there are a lot of people I know who will have, they'll have scars or things on their bodies, and they're not even aware of that. It's like, what's that on your leg? Oh, I didn't notice. Because, we're just focused our attention is divided. And one of the characteristics of our time is that there's just noises and bells and objects telling you somebody's calling you. So there's a lot of things to divide our attention, but the effort of bringing all of that together allows for this sort of deeper awareness, I think. So again, that's one of those things we work at.